Welcome to the Medical Software Consulting channel. The explainer video will now begin.
Hello everyone, this is Medical Software Consulting. In this video, we will look back in detail at the accidents involving the Therac 25 radiation therapy machine in the 1980s. By revisiting these events, we will explore what must be done to prevent software-related medical accidents and why today's regulatory requirements for medical device software are so essential. For those involved in medical device development, this is an opportunity to reflect on the origins of software regulation. We hope it helps you recognize once again that your daily efforts to comply with standards are ultimately about preventing such tragedies from ever happening again. This video will be structured as follows. 1. The Therac 25 radiation therapy accidents. 2. Analysis of the causes. 3. Safe software design for medical devices. Lessons from the accidents. 4. Summary. First, we will introduce the accidents of the Therac 25 radiation therapy machine in the following sequence. A. The development history of Therac 25. B. 6 cases of overdose and patient harm. C. The challenges of investigating software-related accidents. The Therac 25 was a radiation therapy machine designed to deliver high-energy penetrating radiation deep into a patient's body, destroying cancer cells while minimizing damage to surrounding healthy tissue. From its treatment head, it could deliver 2 types of radiation: electron beams, beta particles, and X-rays. To generate penetrating X-rays, a stream of high-energy electrons was directed onto a metal target. In contrast, when operating in electron beam mode, the machine automatically moved the target out of the way, reduced the electron energy level, and delivered the beam directly to the tumor. Because low-energy electron beams have less penetrating power than X-rays, they were used primarily for treating cancers located near the surface of the skin. One of the most critical components of the Therac 25 was the turntable, which adjusted the position of the electron beam according to the type of radiation therapy selected. In the first position, high-energy electrons struck a metal target to generate X-rays. In the second position, a scanning magnet spread the electron beam to a density safe enough for direct treatment. The third position, known as the field light position, blocked the electron beam with a mirror and projected visible light onto the patient's body, allowing the operator to accurately align the treatment area. 3 microswitches attached to the turntable monitored its position. The signals from these switches were sent to the computer, enabling the system to determine the exact position of the turntable. The Therac 25 was an unprecedented radiation therapy machine, capable of switching between 2 very different radiation modes that released large amounts of energy into the human body, controlled entirely by computer software. The Therac series was operated by a Digital Equipment Corporation PDP-11, a widely adopted 16-bit computer in the 1970s and 1980s, known for being compact, cost-effective, and powerful for its time. This represented one of the earliest cases of a general-purpose computer being used to control a medical device. The PDP-11's console terminal was the VT100, a monochrome display with a keyboard and 80 by 24 characters. Initially, the Therac 6 was an X-ray-only machine that incorporated hardware-based safety features. Later, the Therac 20 introduced 2 modes, X-rays and electron beams. It included an independent protective circuit to monitor scanned electron beams and mechanical interlocks to ensure safe operation. However, in the case of the Therac 25, the designers relied on the presumed superiority of computer control. They removed many of the hardware safety mechanisms and interlocks, attempting instead to implement safety functions purely through software. In the early 1970s, Thomson CSF, CGR, of France and Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, AECL, began a joint venture to develop linear accelerators. Later, using AECL's double-pass electron acceleration system, which could generate the same energy levels within a much smaller space, CGR developed the Therac 6, a treatment machine that used only X-rays. In the Therac 6, the computer was used only for peripheral tasks and did not control the overall operation of the machine. Following the success of the Therac 6, the more advanced Therac 20 was developed, capable of producing both X-rays and electron beams. In this system, the computer began to play an important role in machine operation. However, the safety mechanisms built into the Therac 20 were not controlled by software. Instead, electrical circuits integrated into fuses and breakers automatically shut off the beam in the event of incorrect or unsafe operations. The partnership between AECL and CGR ended in 1981, after which AECL took over the development of the Therac 25. The Therac 25 software consisted of about 20,000 lines of code, developed over 7 years by a single programmer. While parts of the program were inherited from the Therac 6 and Therac 20, many new functions were added to accommodate the features of the Therac 25. The Therac 20 had included an independent protective circuit to monitor the scanned electron beam, as well as mechanical interlocks to ensure safe operation. However, AECL placed its confidence in the superior capabilities of computer control. In doing so, it removed the hardware safety mechanisms and interlocks, attempting instead to implement safety functions entirely in software. This meant that highly safety-critical medical device software was developed under a joint arrangement between a French and a Canadian company, and then handed off from one party to the other. Such a process made the software particularly prone to hidden problems and risks. Those who had the opportunity to examine the Therac 25 software were surprised to find that there was almost no documentation available and no descriptions in plain English explaining the functions of different parts of the program. Moreover, there was no evidence that the software had undergone thorough testing together with the hardware prior to shipment. 11 Therac 25 units were installed, 5 in the United States and 6 in Canada. More than half were involved in accidents. Between June 1985 and January 1987, at least 6 patients were severely injured or died. These events reveal how flaws in design, software, and organizational response combined to produce tragedy. June 3, 1985, Marietta, Georgia. At the Kennestone Regional Cancer Center, a 61-year-old woman was receiving radiation therapy after tumor surgery. When treatment began, she screamed that her spine felt on fire. In fact, 150 to 200 grays had been concentrated on her spinal cord instead of the intended fraction. She suffered paralysis and severe pain. AECL, the manufacturer, was contacted but dismissed the possibility of malfunction as impossible. No full investigation followed, and other hospitals were not warned. A lawsuit was settled out of court. July 26, 1985, Hamilton, Ontario. During her 24th session, a 40-year-old woman's treatment shut down after 5 seconds with an H-tilt error. The operator retried several times before the machine locked itself. Soon after, the patient complained of burning pain and swelling in her back. She died later that year, officially from cancer, though doctors believed radiation injury was severe. AECL speculated about a faulty microswitch and only advised clinics to check the turntable position manually. A software update followed months later, but the true cause was never proven. December 1985, Yakima, Washington. A woman developed streak-like redness on her hip resembling the beam aperture. She continued treatment while staff searched for an explanation. Later analysis linked the injury to a software race condition caused by a variable overflow. She survived but was left with skin necrosis and chronic pain. March 21, 1986, Tyler, Texas. A male patient was prescribed 180 rads but received 165 to 250 grays because rapid typing by the operator triggered a race condition. The overdose struck a 1 square centimeter area. He immediately became quadriplegic and died 5 months later. Earlier machines such as the Therac 20 had hardware interlocks to prevent this. The Therac 25, relying on software alone, offered no such protection. April 11, 1986, Tyler, Texas. Just weeks later, another patient was killed at the same facility. Despite an error message, a beam of about 250 grays hit his brainstem. He died within 3 weeks. The The cause was the same uncorrected race condition. Findings at the University of Chicago, Dr. Frank Bova examined the older Therac 20 and observed that fast typing or corrections often caused shutdowns by blowing fuses. On the Therac 20, these failures protected patients. On the Therac 25 without hardware safeguards, the same flaws translated into lethal overdoses. This showed the core problem was not operator error, but unsafe design. January 17, 1987, Yakima, Washington. During neck treatment, the unit was still in the field light position when the operator pressed set at the instant a variable dropped to 0. Instead of harmless setup, an 80 to 100 gray beam was delivered. The patient cried out in pain and died 3 months later. After this accident, regulators in Canada and the U.S. recommended removing all Therac 25 units from service until redesigned. Systemic failures. Victims' symptoms, burning, paralysis, or skin damage, were often mistaken for routine side effects. Only after repeated cases at different hospitals was the machine itself blamed. AECL's response was slow and dismissive, attributing reports to operator error and overlooking design flaws. Critical hardware protections had been removed under the assumption that software was reliable. The lack of rigorous engineering, combined with poor communication between manufacturer, hospitals, and regulators, allowed lethal defects to remain for years. Conclusion: the Therac 25 accidents were not isolated glitches, but the result of systemic failures in software, hardware design, and organizational culture. At least 6 patients died, and others were permanently harmed. These events reshaped medical device regulation, embedding requirements for risk management, redundant safeguards, and independent software validation. The lesson endures. In safety-critical systems, relying solely on unverified software creates unacceptable risks, with consequences measured in human lives. Here, we introduce how Professor Nancy Levison of MIT became involved in the investigation of the Therac 25 accidents. Today, she is a leading authority in system safety at MIT's Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. But in 1985, she was an associate professor at the University of Washington, a researcher in her 30s. In the early 1980s, computer control was expanding into fields such as nuclear power, aviation, and medicine. Yet at the time, no accidents were believed to have been directly caused by software. Amid this context, a short article appeared in a North American newspaper reporting that a series of patients had been severely injured by a radiation therapy machine for unknown reasons. When Levison read the piece, she immediately thought, at last, software itself may have caused a fatal accident. For her, as a researcher of safety-critical systems, this represented the most urgent and compelling case study imaginable. After gathering publicly available information as initial pieces of the puzzle, Levison's next step was the exhaustive collection of primary sources. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain FDA medical device reports, MDRS, contacted the health departments of Texas and Ontario directly, and secured inspection notes. She also obtained technical modification documents that the manufacturer, AECL, had distributed to hospitals. By this time, the FDA had already classified the machines involved in the accidents as defective and ordered corrective action plans, forcing the manufacturer to release at least some documentation. Levison then took these scattered pieces, court records, log files, and technical notes, and carefully threaded them together to reconstruct both the timeline of events and the technical chain of causality. To conduct a multifaceted analysis of the accidents, including details of radiation dosage and the turntable mechanism, Levison formed a collaborative research team with Clark Turner, a PhD student in the Department of Information and Computer Science at UC Irvine, who was also licensed to practice law in California, New York, and Massachusetts. Neither Levison nor Turner were official investigators for the FDA. However, citing the public interest, they independently requested and collected litigation records, as well as internal documents from regulators and the manufacturer. They also secured opportunities for additional hearings, allowing them to probe deeply into the factual details of the case. In 1993, Levison and Turner published a 24-page article in IEE Computer titled An Investigation of the Therac 25 Accidents. For the first time, the details of medical accidents directly caused by software bugs were made public, sparking a global debate on whether the software development process itself should be subject to regulation. The FDA adopted the article as teaching material, incorporating it as a case study in its General Principles of Software Validation Guidance, first issued as a draft in 1997 and finalized in 2002. In line with international harmonization, this work ultimately led to the establishment of IEC 62304 in 2006, which forms the foundation of today's regulatory framework for medical device software. Because the inner workings of software are not easily visible, investigating the root causes of medical accidents triggered by software is extremely difficult. It requires both a deep understanding of the software's structure and persistent interviews with the developers themselves. The article, An Investigation of the Therac 25 Accidents, remains a rare example of successfully analyzing in detail the causes of software-induced accidents. Professor Nancy Levison later went on to serve on NASA's Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel and the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, becoming a leading authority in safety across multiple domains, including defense, healthcare, and nuclear power. From here, we will analyze the Therac 25 accidents in detail, following this sequence. A. The accident case in Tyler, Texas. B. The accident case at Yakima Valley Memorial Hospital, circa the internal processing structure of the Therac 25D. The program flow of the Therac 25E. Reimagining the Therac 25 using modern software design techniques. At this point, let us take a look at how the Therac 25 was actually operated. This is the screen of a VT100 terminal, the standard video terminal of the time, which could display only 80 by 24 characters in monochrome. Radiation therapists followed a three-step process: first, entering prescribed values into the console using the keyboard; second, performing manual adjustments with the physical hand controls; and finally, verifying the entered values against the settings before proceeding. On the screen, the beam type was indicated as X for X-rays and E for electron beams, along with more than a dozen other parameters such as energy level and field size. Once entered, the inputs were immediately sent to the PDP-11, where the software directly controlled the hardware. At the Tyler Clinic, the message Malfunction 54 appeared, but the staff did not realize that it indicated the possibility of an overdose, and treatment was continued. After the overdose accident, Dr. Hager at the Tyler Clinic and the Therac 25 operator worked late into the night and finally discovered the exact conditions under which the fatal Malfunction 54 occurred. It was triggered by the speed at which a particular sequence of commands was entered. The operator, who had been working with the machine for quite some time, was highly experienced and entered data at a very fast pace. She quickly typed in the treatment parameters and, when necessary, used the built-in editing function of the Therac 25 to make corrections. In both of the Tyler accidents, when selecting the treatment mode, she initially typed X for X-ray instead of E for electron beam. Since most treatments used X-rays, entering X was a common mistake. As usual, she used the up arrow key on the keyboard to move the cursor to the correct field and corrected the beam setting. Because all of the other parameters were correct, she left them unchanged and pressed the return key several times. When she reached the bottom of the screen, a message appeared confirming that the parameters had been verified, followed by the display, Beam Ready. This diagram recreates the software structure that led to the overdose accident in Tyler, Texas. The key point is that the hand task, a non-critical task shown at the lower left of the screen, and the treat task, a critical task running in a 100 millisecond cycle on the right, were loosely coupled through a global variable called MEOS, Memory Energy Offset. Let us look at the relationship between the keyboard input task, the global variable MEOS, and the data entry complete flag. The keyboard handler parsed character strings from the VT100 terminal and stored them in a 2-byte variable called MEOS mode energy offset. The lower byte was read by the hand task, which controlled the turntable, while the upper byte was used for table lookups of treatment parameters. When input was finished, the keyboard handler set a global flag called Data Entry Complete to 1. However, this flag was raised only at the moment the cursor returned to the command line. If the cursor was later moved and values were re-edited, the flag was not updated. In modern object-oriented languages, global variables are avoided. Yet even today, 40 years later, it is not uncommon to see C programs in which global variables still create tight coupling between software modules. The block on the right represents the treat task. It consisted of 8 subroutines and used a state variable called T-phase to transition from state 0, reset, to state 1, data entry, and then to state 3, setup test. This was a state machine design approach where the current status is managed by a variable. The inherent risk of a state machine is that the state recognized internally by the software may diverge from the actual physical state. The Therac 25 accident was precisely such a case, where that risk became a reality. Each time the data entry routine was called, every 100 milliseconds, it checked whether the data entry complete flag was set to 1. If so, it immediately advanced T-phase to state 3. In other words, even if the operator was in the middle of correcting an input error, the system could still proceed to the next phase, making this a dangerously flawed design. In this case, the prescribed dose was 180 rads of electron beam radiation. The operator was supposed to enter E, which would set the MEOS variable to electron beam mode. However, she mistakenly typed X and then immediately moved the cursor back to correct it to E. As a result of this sequence, the upper byte of the MEOS variable was set for electron mode, while the lower byte retained the offset setting for X-ray mode. This created a discrepancy between the operator's final intended settings and the values actually stored inside the computer. Subsequently, the setup task incorrectly judged that there was no mode inconsistency and set the bending magnet flag. Because the hardware interlocks had been removed during design, a 25 megaelectron-volt electron beam, delivering 16 to 25 kilograms, struck the patient directly. The patient screamed that it felt like being hit in the back and suffered immediate spinal cord damage leading to paralysis of all 4 limbs. He died 5 months later. In this incident, there was no mechanism to detect asynchronous updates between the critical task and the user interface task. Moreover, replacing hardware safety interlocks with software checks meant that a single software bug could directly result in massive radiation overdoses. The inconsistency within the software was invisible from the outside, and with the hardware safeguards removed, there was no way to prevent the release of excessive energy onto the patient. Here we will explain the internal mechanism behind the Therac 25 overdose accident that occurred in January 1987 at Yakima Valley Memorial Hospital in Washington State. Unlike the accident at the Tyler Clinic in Texas, this case involved the delivery of a 25 megaelectron-volt electron beam, even though the upper turntable was in the field light position. The field light position is intended exclusively for setup and alignment, with all treatment accessories removed so that only a lamp and mirror project visible light onto the patient. If a high-energy beam is emitted in this position, 3 critical safety barriers, beam shaping, dosimetry, and beam scattering, are all bypassed, leading to extreme overdosing. In the setup test subroutine, State 3, a flag called Class 3 was incremented every 100 milliseconds to check the position of the upper collimator. Class 3 was an 8-bit variable that counted from 0 to 255, then overflowed back to 0 on the 256th cycle. This cycle took 25.6 seconds, 100 milliseconds times 256. The software was designed so that when the flag was 0, the upper collimator position check would be skipped. During the third phase, setup test, the treat task accepted input from the Set button. If the button was pressed at the precise instant that Class 3 overflowed to 0, the H-keeper abnormality monitoring task interpreted this as no collimator check required. As a result, the 25 megaelectron-volt electron beam was fired in field light position without beam shaping, dosimetry, or scattering. Without a target or scattering foil in place, the electron beam reached the patient as a narrow, millimeter-wide pencil beam. The patient suffered massive tissue necrosis and multi-organ complications from the overdose and died in April. In this case, AECL's interim fix was to change the software so that Class 3 was assigned a constant non-zero value instead of being incremented. This revealed that the incrementation of Class 3 had no real purpose in the first place. Once identified, many software flaws seem like simple mistakes that invite the question, why was it ever designed that way? But tracing the root cause of accidents back to software is extremely difficult, precisely because software is invisible. This underscores the importance of maintaining documentation that explains the design intent, the software structure, how diagnosis and treatment are implemented, and what risk controls are in place. It also illustrates why the FDA, in its most recent pre-market guidance, now requires the submission of system and software architecture diagrams. Here, we will examine the internal processing of the Therac 25 software, as reconstructed from the paper by Levison and Turner. In the 1970s and 1980s, when the Therac series was developed, real-time operating systems were not yet widely available. Instead, the Therac 25 relied on a custom-built lightweight scheduler. The Therac 25 needed to handle multiple processes in real time, such as accepting input from the keyboard, generating electron beams, and controlling mechanical components. Today, such time-critical multitasking systems would normally be built on top of a real-time operating system. The Therac 25 software consisted of interrupt-driven routines triggered by hardware events, along with a 100-millisecond periodic task launched by those interrupts. The interrupt handlers included a clock interrupt to count 100-millisecond cycles, a scanning interrupt, a trap interrupt, power-on routines, treatment console screen interrupts, and service keyboard interrupts. The 100-millisecond periodic tasks were divided into high-priority critical tasks and lower-priority non-critical tasks. Critical tasks included the treat task, responsible for treatment monitoring, the servo task, controlling electron gun firing and dose rate, and the housekeeper task, H task, for abnormality monitoring. Non-critical tasks included console keyboard input handling, console screen updating, and hand control processing. When the periodic 100-millisecond task was invoked, the treat task was executed. It referenced a global variable called T-phase to determine which state, 0 through 7, the system was currently in, and then executed the subroutine assigned to that state. As shown in the diagram, this was a typical structure of real-time multitasking software before the spread of real-time operating systems, a main loop with interrupt handlers using global variables to branch execution within the loop and manage multiple processes. The structural weakness of this design was that the subroutines branched within the main loop were tightly coupled through global variables, which could be accessed by multiple tasks. This created a risk of task conflicts, and without explicit exclusion handling, inconsistencies could arise in the system. By contrast, the basic principle of modern object-oriented design is to build each software component with high cohesion and loose coupling. In other words, each component's responsibility should be clearly defined, with no overlaps, and the connections between components kept as weak as possible. This increases the independence of each component, makes it easier to identify the faulty component when a defect occurs, and also makes it easier to verify components individually. So, was the Therac 25 software architecture bad? Not necessarily. Considering the era, when real-time operating systems were not yet common, it was actually a reasonably well-organized architecture. However, the lack of proper software documentation at the time of design was a serious problem. It is not uncommon for software engineers to carry the design in their heads without leaving documentation. But in medical device software, when an accident occurs after release, it is critical to investigate the cause quickly and implement countermeasures. something that requires documentation of the software. One factor that contributed to the flaws in the Therac 25 software was that, when modifications were made in response to user requests, the original software architecture was undermined. As a result, the independence of software components was lost, and task conflicts were introduced. In modern development, these issues can be prevented by using a real-time operating system and object-oriented design. Still, it is technically possible to build software with an architecture like that of the Therac 25. Because software is invisible from the outside, as long as the machine behaves the same, the architectural differences are not apparent. This slide shows the flowchart of the program processing in the Therac 25 radiation therapy machine. The source is the paper by Levison and Turner published in IEEE Computer, reconstructed from actual source code and design notes. On the far left is the data entry module. Here, the operator's input for mode and energy is processed. Mode refers to the type of treatment, such as X-ray mode or electron beam mode. Energy specifies the strength of the radiation, for example 6 MeV or 25 MeV. This module first checks whether both mode and energy have been specified. If so, it retrieves and outputs the corresponding parameters. Once all parameters are set, control passes to the magnet module. What is important here is that the condition for moving from data entry to magnet was extremely simple. By following a particular sequence of inputs quickly, it was possible to bypass safety checks that should normally have been enforced. At the center is the magnet module. This module controlled the electromagnets that determined whether the electron beam would strike the target to produce X-rays or bypass the target and be delivered directly to the patient as an electron beam. In X-ray mode, the beam hits the target to generate X-rays. In electron beam mode, the target is moved aside so the beam reaches the patient directly. Within the magnet module, a magnet coupling flag was set, after which the p-time module was called to perform timed processing. On the right is the p-time module, responsible for timing control and edit detection. If the magnet coupling flag was on, p-time first checked whether mode or energy had been changed. If a change was detected, it cleared the magnet flag and returned control to the data entry module. However, in the actual implementation, this change detection occurred only on the first call. On subsequent calls, even if the operator made changes, they were not detected. As a result, during the 8-second magnet setup period, any edits made afterward were not communicated back to the data entry module. This meant that reinitialization was not performed, leaving a critical design flaw. The routine in time that checked whether the mode or energy had been changed appears to have been added later, in response to complaints that operators were frustrated by the system taking too long to process setting changes. After the accidents, AECL modified the software so that clearing the magnet coupling flag was no longer handled within time, but instead after the magnet loop finished. They also added a shared variable to indicate whether the cursor was still in input mode, so the system could correctly recognize when parameters were being edited. In the Tyler accident, the operator entered the mode and energy, then used the cursor up key to make corrections, and re-entered the values within about 8 seconds. This triggered the flaw, and treatment continued with incorrect settings, resulting in a massive overdose. The Therac 25 accidents were the product of a complex interplay between software design flaws and human operational behavior. The design decision to increase reliance on software while reducing independent hardware safety mechanisms compared to earlier machines also contributed to the severity of the accidents. This slide explains how the Therac 25 software could have been designed if modern software engineering practices had been applied. These models were created using a UML tool, Enterprise Architect. First, on the left, we have the class diagram. This shows the static structure of the software components that make up the system. In object-oriented design, variables inside a class are generally inaccessible from the outside. A minus sign before a variable indicates that it is private and cannot be read directly by other classes. Information is obtained only through methods provided by the class, its public services, indicated with a plus sign. This concept is known as encapsulation. It reduces coupling between components while increasing both cohesion and independence. The Therac 25 software, however, was the opposite. Multiple components shared and accessed global variables simultaneously. This caused race conditions between tasks and led to inconsistent variable states, which directly contributed to the accidents. In modern design, global variables are strictly avoided. Instead, variables are kept private within classes. Communication with other components is done through well-defined interfaces with strict access control. The classes shown here for X-ray treatment, electron beam treatment, abnormality monitoring, collimator position detection, and turntable position detection are all classified as Software Safety Class C under IEC 62304. Class C applies to software whose failure could result in serious harm to the patient. At this level, complete requirements specifications, rigorous design integrity, and thorough regression testing after any change are mandatory. By clarifying responsibilities and preserving independence between classes, both unit testing and regression testing become easier. Next, in the center, is the state machine diagram. This visualizes the transitions between system states, showing exactly which transitions are possible. In the Therac 25, it was possible to transition into the treatment state before setup was fully completed. This design flaw created parameter inconsistencies that led directly to overdoses. In modern design, such unsafe transitions are prevented by explicitly defining transition conditions. For example, the system would not be allowed to enter the treatment state unless all setup steps were completed. Additional safety conditions, such as completion flag set and abnormality monitor OK, are incorporated to further reduce the risk of malfunction. On the right is the fault tree analysis FTA. This logical analysis breaks down the conditions required for a serious event, in this case overdose, to occur. In the Therac 20, even if the software misconfigured the machine, independent hardware safety devices could stop the output. But in the Therac 25, these hardware interlocks were removed for cost reasons, leaving only software monitoring. As a result, systematic software failures could no longer be mitigated by hardware, leading directly to accidents. In modern safety design, the principle of defense in depth is fundamental. Safety is ensured not only by software monitoring, but also by retaining physical safety devices so that they can back each other up. For example, even if the software fails, a circuit breaker can still trip, or a mechanism can physically block beam generation. In summary, by applying modern software design techniques, it is possible to build safety into the system from the architectural level. However, because software is invisible from the outside, systems with the same external behavior could still suffer from the same flaws as those built 40 years ago, depending on the design philosophy. This is why ISO 14971 Risk Management, IEC 62304 Safety Classification, and rigorous design and verification requirements are indispensable in medical device software development. From here, we will consider the lessons for safe design of medical device software drawn from these accidents. A. Integrate safety design from the early stages of development. B. Thorough change management and impact assessment. C. Comprehensive safety analysis review. D. Consideration of human factors and clinical operation environment. Ensuring independence of the safety management system. Safety in medical device software cannot be added as an afterthought. From the earliest stages of design, especially during architecture design, it is essential to plan for redundancy and fail-safe mechanisms. If hardware safety features are replaced with software, the software must be proven through testing and analysis on the actual device to provide reliability equal to or greater than the hardware it replaces. Nancy Levison's statement, "Safety cannot be added on later," is particularly symbolic. In the case of the Therac 25, hardware interlocks were removed and safety was entrusted to software alone. This led directly to radiation overdose accidents. Had layered defenses been considered at the design stage with both hardware and software safety mechanisms, many of the accidents could likely have been prevented. IEC 62304 requires that risk control measures be clearly defined during requirements analysis and architecture design, and that external safety mechanisms be incorporated when necessary. In addition, IEC 60601-1 mandates design practices that ensure both essential performance and basic safety. Every change, whether large or small, must be evaluated for its impact on safety. Even minor corrections require a full risk analysis at the system level. In accordance with the design change procedures of ISO 13485, the approval process must be clearly defined, and both the scope of impact and the risk level must be explicitly documented. Even small changes can have unexpected effects on safety. After the accidents, AECL applied patch-like fixes to the software. However, because they proceeded without identifying the root cause, further accidents occurred. This is a classic example of failing to conduct a comprehensive safety reassessment during change management. IEC 62304 mandates a structured change management process, including a required safety impact assessment for every modification. Likewise, ISO 13485 requires documentation and traceability of design changes, meaning that even a simple bug fix must be re-evaluated from a safety perspective. Most accidents do not result from the failure of a single component, but from complex interactions among multiple elements. In addition to unit testing and code reviews, system-level safety analysis is needed to detect defects related to concurrency and timing dependencies. A combination of methods, such as formal methods and software FMEA, should be applied, and independent review teams can also be highly effective. In the Tyler accident, the root cause was the lack of task synchronization and inconsistencies in shared variables. Defects of this kind, arising from concurrent processing, are extremely difficult to detect through unit testing alone, making system-level safety analysis indispensable. IEC 62304 requires that software safety be verified through integration and system testing, while ISO 14971 emphasizes the importance of system-wide safety analysis as part of risk management. System design must anticipate user operation patterns, ensuring safety even in cases of abnormal actions or rapid input. Operating procedures should be clearly defined, with confirmation steps inserted where appropriate. When making changes to the user interface, the risk of bypassing safety mechanisms must also be evaluated. Human factors engineering, based on usability design principles from IEC 62366, is highly effective in this regard. In the Therac 25 accidents, the rapid keystroke input of an experienced operator caused inconsistencies in internal variables, leading directly to overdoses. Designs that underestimate the influence of user expertise and operating habits can introduce serious risks. IEC 62366 requires developers to account for the user's working environment and operational characteristics, and to integrate the user interface with safety mechanisms as part of the overall design. Safety monitoring must be physically and logically separated from the control system to ensure independence. Instead of relying on self-checking alone, a separate monitoring mechanism should be implemented to avoid common cause failures. Redundancy and cross-check mechanisms are also effective. Self-monitoring without independent checks is dangerous. In the Therac 25, reliance on software self-monitoring, combined with the removal of independent hardware safety systems, was a major factor in the severity of the accidents. IEC 62304 allows the software safety class to be reduced if external risk control measures are in place. However, this is only permitted when the independence of the monitoring mechanism is assured. Summary. Finally, let us reflect on the lessons from the Therac 25 accidents regarding the attitudes of developers and organizations. Nancy Levison viewed the causes not simply as programming errors, but as problems rooted in the mindset of software development and in organizational culture. She highlighted issues such as overconfidence that software does not fail. Therac 25 had been in use for a long period without incident, leading to the mistaken belief that it was safe. But reliability is not the same as safety. Lack of defensive design. The system was missing mechanisms to anticipate worst-case scenarios and to monitor or diagnose internal states. Failure to eliminate root causes. Fixing defects in a piecemeal way cannot ensure the safety of the overall system. Complacency and unrealistic risk assessment. Excessive reliance on past accident-free records and probabilistic evaluations blinded the team to fundamental risks. Naive expectations about software reuse. They underestimated the fact that software safety is not automatically guaranteed when reused in a different environment. These lessons remain highly relevant in today's medical device development. Developers must go beyond regulatory compliance and design techniques. They must constantly question their own assumptions and organizational habits and continuously verify safety. Only by improving not just technology but also organizational culture and decision-making can truly safe medical devices be achieved.